wider group need to acknowledge that this was going on our streets, and we need to be aware of how much needs to change and how much action is needed. So both really good news to see solidarity, but it feels like a lot of the media have just moved on as if we acknowledge that this was going on our streets, and we need to be aware of how much needs to change and how. Okay, I think the echo's gone away. Uh, Part of the kind of antidote to that, to me, is the Muslim Greens. The amazing work that you're doing in communities around the country, but also putting on lecture series like this. We know education is a huge part of this. And I imagine that most people on this call tonight are already educated around a lot of these issues. And so we need to reach out even more people who wouldn't, necessarily dream of joining a Zoom call like this, but starting with our own inner circles and people we know, and growing is the exact way to deal with this hate, is through information and education. So I'm really pleased to see the lectures that are happening there. We also know that there's lots of policy, and that's a whole nother talk for another night, but I'm really pleased at the positions the Green Party are taking, both internationally in terms of our solidarity with Palestine and calling out the genocide and apartheid in Israel, but of course domestic issues of religious freedom, of making sure that we're standing up against racism in this country, and also all the issues around the cost of living crisis, which affect all communities, including the Muslim community. And I'm really proud of our party's commitment to tackling inequality. Anyway, that is enough from me. I'm going to introduce our speaker. Our speaker tonight is Alexandra Darby. Alexandra, who I'm sure you know because you've come to see her, is a UCL graduate in natural sciences and wrote her master's thesis on AI in weapons and the way this is framed in the UK policy space. She is a trustee for the Islamic Society of Britain and spent a year as coordinator for their youth division. She's the lead for AI and digital rights at FEM-YSO, and has been working on their AI Islamophobia campaign to raise awareness on the impact of biased technologies on the lives of young Muslims. So it's my absolute delight to introduce tonight Alexandra. Alexandra, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to the organisers for setting this up. I hope you will all bear with me as I do the very complicated task of trying to share my screen, but hopefully you should all be able to see that slide. Get thumbs up from the organisers, or I'm going to take the silence as a okay. Not yet.
I can see it, but it's got a buffering thing on it.
Ah, okay. Well, I hope the buffering thing will go away. I'm not quite sure why that would be the case. But I can get started in the meantime. So thank you again to the organizers for setting this up, and for all of you for creating a solidarity space to discuss these vital issues during Islamophobia Awareness Month. So I'm going to start by saying Bismillah, which means in the name of God. Now, as a warning, is that this is a big topic, and I'm going to be focusing on a very few small aspects of it. And I'm really keen to hear your questions and to discuss this more broadly. So I'll try to stick to time, but I hope that you will be patient with me if I go a little over time. So, as was said at the beginning, my name is Alexandra Darby, and I am the AI and digital rights lead at FEMYSO. Okay, let me try. Stop sharing my screen and try again. Right. You'd think after so long of doing virtual meetings, we would be good at this. Is it still buffering, or is it clearer?
I see no buffering. I just see a small line of text on a black screen.
That's very odd. In that case, we may have to go ahead without my slides, but let me try and change. Is that any clearer? Because it was working before.
Let me just try one more time.
Okay.
I've got the buffering thing still. It says Alexander.
All right. Third time lucky, and then we'll go ahead, and you'll just have to bear with me that these, take my word for it, that these were quite cool slides. Right.
I see something.
Please, can everyone turn their cameras off?
we'll hopefully get started. Alexandra's just going to get reconnected again. Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's Farha Said from the Muslim Greens. Are you ready, Alexandra?
Yes. I'm wondering if I try one more time, just in case now it's slightly more happy. And if not, I will just go ahead and start speaking.
Yay!
Yeah, alhamdulillah.
Yeah, we can see
Okay,
it.
alhamdulillah. Right, so my name is Alexandra Darby, and I am the AI and Digital Rights Lead at Femiso. And before we start, I'm going to situate myself in this discussion and explain the context that I will be speaking from. So first of all, I'm a British Muslim convert, so I wasn't born Muslim. I volunteer for Femiso, which is a civil society organization based in Brussels. So I'll talk about a range of European examples, but try to link it back to the UK. At university, I studied the history and sociology of science, and I currently work for a science funding organization. So it is possible that in the Q&A, I will answer questions by giving some health or science-related answer to the impact of AI and bias. And I have been privileged to be part of lots of Muslim youth organizations, and I'm passionate about EDI. So we'll focus on the issues of Muslim underprivilege in digitalization, but also talk about the intersectionality of these discriminations. But to better contextualize this topic, I'm going to start with a case study from the Netherlands. Fraud in social security systems became a prominent political issue in the Netherlands from the early 1990s. And successive governments put in place harsher and harsher policies to show that they were taking the issue seriously. In 2013, the Dutch tax authorities introduced an algorithmic decision-making system known as a risk classification model to detect fraud in child benefits. This is money paid to families with young children who are considered to be earning below a threshold to help with the cost of raising these children. This algorithmic decision-making system included self-learning elements, which created risk profiles of childcare benefit applicants who were supposedly more likely to submit inaccurate applications or renewals and to potentially commit fraud. When an account was flagged, a civil servant would then conduct a manual review of the case, but they were given no information or context as to why the account had been flagged. Now, a question for you all to think about is how many of us will question Google Maps when it changes the route whilst we're driving, or when ChatGPT summarizes an article? We trust these things to do the job they're made to do. Now, the tax authorities also had to prove the efficiency of this algorithmic decision-making system, as they had spent lots of money on it. And the way to do that was by seizing enough funds from alleged fraudsters to cover the costs of purchasing and running the system. Now, this challenge created a political and financial incentive to seize as many funds as possible, regardless really of the correctness of the accusations. And by seizing lots of funds, this allowed authorities to claim that it had hugely increased the number of fraudulent child benefits that had been stopped and that money had been saved by the state. When applicants and applications were flagged, parents and caregivers were requested to provide additional information to prove their entitlement to benefits. However, when they tried to find out what information was considered incorrect or false or missing, they were met with silence. The tax authorities consistently refused to clarify their decisions, and it was basically impossible for parents, caregivers, journalists, politicians, oversight bodies, or civil society to obtain meaningful information about the existence and workings of the risk classification model. Now, for anyone that's more of a realist than an optimist about these technologies will not be surprised by this, but the system made lots of mistakes, and thousands of families were impacted. The system punished parents and caregivers who accidentally made minor administrative errors on applications or renewals. A missing signature or a late or incomplete payment had severe consequences. Parents and caregivers were asked to repay any money that they had received, recently and before, which for many was large sums, and it was payable immediately in a lump sum. And even if you did all of this, you were labeled by the state as a fraud. Unsurprisingly, this led to devastating financial problems for families, ranging from debt and unemployment to forced evictions because people weren't able to pay rent or make payments on their mortgages. Others were left with mental health issues and stress, which impacted personal and family relationships, leading to divorces and broken homes. But even outside of small mistakes in filling in the forms, the algorithm learned that if you had a foreign name or non-European dual nationality, to flag your account as fraudulent. The algorithm also used donating money to mosques or Islamic organizations as a prompt to highlight the account as fraudulent. Now, once you were labeled a fraud on their system, you were then put onto a police watch list, which meant you had greater surveillance and were more likely to be stopped and searched. And if you had a car, your number plate would be flagged if you drove through certain areas. And this watch list was shared with Interpol. So this increased surveillance also happened when families left the Netherlands for a holiday. Whilst this issue came to public attention in 2018, it wasn't until May 2022 that the Dutch government publicly admitted that institutional racism from the Dutch Tax and Customs Administration was the root cause of the Dutch childcare benefit scandal. Now, this scandal is the result of improper government action, harsh rules and policies around benefits, ruthless benefit recovery policies, obstruction of legal and investigative procedures, and the failure of Dutch authorities to take action in response to people who raised the alarm. And I wanted to start with this case study to show the risks and harms that can, have, and are happening when AI systems are used in public services, and how important considering the experience of minoritized groups is. It was as a result of this failing that for almost a decade, thousands of mostly low socioeconomic people, and disproportionately from minoritized backgrounds, were criminalized, put into debt, and in some cases, their children were taken into state custody. Now, part of this was the result of rubbish in, rubbish out, where the model was trained on biased data. But part of this is also that their voices didn't matter when they questioned the decision. They were presumed guilty, and there was a political desire for this technology to be seen as the solution. And that's why civil society organizations like Femiso are concerned about this. So who actually are Femiso? So we are the Forum of European Muslim Youth and Student Organizations. We are the leading pan-European Muslim youth network, and we work on an institutional level to represent the concerns and needs of the diverse population of Muslim youth in Europe. Our vision is to be part of a diverse, cohesive, and vibrant Europe where Muslim youth are active contributors and change makers. We work to represent the voices of minoritized youth, working with stakeholders such as the Council of Europe, members of the European Parliament, the European Commission, and other civil society organizations. Now, I am the lead for the AI and digital rights team within the campaigns department of Femiso, and we've been working on this area for just over a year now. We managed to secure funding from the European AI and Digital Rights Fund to carry out a series of projects, and much that I'll be presenting will be things that we've been learning throughout this period. The AI Islamophobia campaign has been our main focus. And we phrase the issue like this because we're concerned by how AI is being used to create and reinforce Islamophobic biases and systems. And we've organized trainings in Brussels for Muslim youth leaders and a red teaming event at the European Parliament where we got participants to challenge large language models to reproduce Islamophobic biases. The problem we found is that there's very little awareness about the reality of the problems we're working on. And this is partly due to the fact that there's no agreed definition for Islamophobia in the EU. The definition that the EU utilizes is the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance of the Council of Europe, but it's disputed, and the European Commission prefers to use the term anti-Muslim hatred. In the UK, we have no government-agreed definition. And all of this means that looking into or understanding what to look for is difficult for many organizations. For example, early on in this work, I attended a conference and met with someone from Who Targets Me. Who Targets Me are a fantastic organization that have developed an add-on to your browser which tracks which political parties target advertising to you on social media. When you sign up, you give the organization some demographic information about yourself, and then you download the add-on, and they'll send you weekly information about which political parties targeted ads towards you. So imagine in the run-up to the American elections, Donald Trump has targeted you 3 times, and things like that. And then this information is shared with civil society organizations. I met them before the European elections, and I asked them excitedly who was targeting Muslims in Europe and who was also specifically not targeting Muslims. And they looked at me kind of sheepishly before admitting that they didn't collect faith information from their participants, so didn't have any data on this. And all of this is to say that some of the examples I'll be sharing in the following section of the talk are areas where it seems highly likely that Muslims are disproportionately targeted, but unfortunately, the data isn't desegregated to tell the faith of the people. So with all of this context and background, I'm going to talk a little bit about the AI Act and why Femiso and other civil societies are concerned about the spaces it leaves and the wins as well. And I'm going to concentrate on the AI Act, which was passed in the European Union recently, because the UK doesn't yet have very developed AI legislation. And so this is a good example of quite comprehensive legislation with key lessons we can learn going forward and some case studies of when it goes very wrong. Now, as I said, I definitely want to start by saying that there have been a lot of wins in the AI Act, and all of these were hard won by civil society organizations, work by groups such as EDRI, Amnesty, the Ada Lovelace Institute, among many others. And if anyone is interested in the brilliant campaigns they ran, I really recommend you look into Protect Not Surveil and Reclaim Your Face, which are the 2 logos you'll see at the bottom of the page. And these lobbied hard for the rights of migrants and the rights to privacy when it comes to biometric surveillance. And they still have lots of things they're campaigning for. And as 2025 is the implementation year for the AI Act, they'll become much more active from January. So watch this space. Now, some of the key wins you can see that the AI Act prohibits are the prohibition of social scoring, predictive policing, AI systems to infer emotions, but only in some spaces, biometric categorization to infer, again, some characteristics, and the rights of police to create or expand facial recognition databases through CCTV scraping. And all of these are brilliant, but however, things in politics are rarely as good as we hope. And all of these have very troubling exemptions. And I think due to time commitments, I'll only be able to talk through some of these. Now, the prohibition on social scoring is the prohibition on the use of AI to classify or evaluate people based on inferred or predicted characteristics. And the problems are that it's difficult to prove. So, for instance, France doesn't collect data on this. So the burden is on groups to collect all of this data to show that there is a problem and that the characteristic of ethnicity, faith, or age is the deciding factor. It's very reliant on litigation for this to actually come into impact. You have to prove the harm in court. The burden of responsibility isn't on the group using the algorithm to check whether this is the case. It's on the groups describing the issue to find the evidence and prove that it's happening. Now, AI decision-making is also a black box. It's difficult to unpack what it's learned, and that's even if you have the right to find out what system is being used and how. And often these systems will provide advice only, so it might not be declared as part of the whole decision-making process. making it really complicated to unpick the patterns and the level of influence. And unfortunately, with many of these wins, there are exemptions to this. For example, anything related to security concerns and counterterrorism. Examples of when this has been a problem are all around social benefit systems. Now, I mentioned at the start of this the Dutch benefit scandal, and this is a screenshot of the Amnesty report. I really recommend you read if you're interested in finding out more. And this one might feel like deja vu, as now evidence is coming out on the discrimination from a similar system used in Denmark. The Amnesty report doesn't mention that it targets Muslims. However, they quote a Muslim grassroots organization that has been campaigning on this issue because they see it impacting their community. And in the introduction, it says that the algorithm is especially targeting people with refugee status, especially from Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And notice in that list that Ukraine isn't mentioned, and also those with multi-generational households. I'll let you decide whether you think that being Muslim could be another common factor in the group of people that they're describing as being disproportionately impacted. And if you thought that was deja vu to the Netherlands case, Amnesty and other organizations are taking a French government department to court over an algorithm they claim is discriminating people when it comes to denying them access to benefits. And now I'm sure you'll agree with me that this is definitely deja vu, but concerns are now being raised about Sweden's system as well. And I want to raise all of this to also say that in the UK, there is no law that forces departments to declare what AI systems they are using and for what purpose. We know that the Department for Work and Pensions that handles universal credit payments is using an AI system to aid in this process, but we don't know much more. Now, by the department's own figures that were recently published, there is a clear racial bias in how universal credit accounts are checked and blocked. So this is an area we should all be worried about in the UK as well. Prohibition on remote biometric identification by police in public space. This is a great win, but again, unfortunately, there's lots of exemptions to this. For example, there's no ban on retrospective facial recognition, so using recorded footage to trace people's movements, using facial recognition and other biometric identifiers is permitted. And again, I want to note that in the UK, we have no ban on this, and the Met Police are actively using live facial recognition in London. Arik Chowdhury has done really good work on this and published a great paper in 2020 called Unmasking Facial Recognition, which I also encourage you all to read. Now, in practical terms for the AI Act, this prohibition and its exemptions mean that governments can invoke national security and a threat of terrorism to introduce biometric facial surveillance systems without having to apply any of the safeguards that the AI Act specifically puts in place against the misuse of these technologies. So without conducting a fundamental rights impact assessment, without ensuring that the AI system meets a high technical standard and does not discriminate against certain groups. Joined to this is the wider problem that biometric categorization, predictive policing, live public facial recognition, and emotion recognition are only partially banned by the AI Act, which legitimizes these dangerous practices. And the loopholes and exemptions provided in the AI Act provide almost a roadway for implementing a constant state of hyper-surveillance. And a very good example of this is what happened during the French Olympics. And I want to just say that La Quadrature du Net is a brilliant organization. And I also thought this title for the article was quite brilliant. So that's a nod to any Star Wars fans in the call. So during the Paris Olympics, France declared a state of exemption because of security concerns. And then they extended this when there was a Taylor Swift concert. And the duration of the period that they've put in place was from the start of this year to the end of this year. Now, I'm pretty sure the Olympics only happens over the summer, but legislation is already being put forward to have these technologies as normative parts of state security. The French government has been debating exactly this in the Bill on Safety in Transportation. When it comes to retrospective facial recognition, this practice is not banned at all by the AI Act. Yet the AI Act makes a big mistake in claiming that the extra time for this retrospective use will mitigate possible harms. But analysis by EDRI shows that the safeguards are not meaningful enough and could easily be circumvented by police. In one place, EDRI say that the safeguards even suggest that simply the suspicion of any crime having taken place would be enough to justify the use of such a system, which is actually a lower threshold than we currently benefit from under EU data protection laws. The prohibition on predictive policing, and I think I'm going to go a few minutes over time, so please bear with me. There's lots of exemptions to this. And the problems are with the way that the prohibition is laid out is that it's limited to individuals. It's limited to those based solely on profiling. And it's not applicable to AI systems supporting human assessment. And as we've seen, even when it's supporting human assessment, it's not an effective safeguard for these systems. Because if it's requiring us to check it, we won't check it. And the case studies I want to talk about are Radar-ite and Prevent. Now, Radar-ite is an automated system used nationally in Germany, and it was implemented in 2019. And it's used by their police in the field of state protection as a risk assessment instrument for violent Islamist extremism. It's a risk assessment tool which ranks individuals in terms of their risk to commit serious violent offenses. The system is one of several very invasive and opaque systems used by German police. But from an Islamophobia perspective, it's especially challenging and problematic. The factors that are used as inputs are not released, and neither are the data points learnt by the algorithm to assign the rankings. The system encourages the surveillance and criminalization of Muslims in Germany. It classifies people as either high or moderate, creating a permanent record to aid in the documentation of the biographical histories of suspects, regardless of the existence of a crime. And these two labels mean that the assumption of guilt is permanent, assigned regardless whether the information is sufficient or not. There is no low-risk category. There is no no-risk category. There is no, maybe you have Islamophobia problems and should go and get EDI training category. And the threshold for using the algorithm isn't defined either. Neither is the number of records currently on the system or the impact this has on Muslims as they navigate life in Germany. Very quickly, prohibition on biometric categorization to infer race, political opinions, trade union membership, religious or philosophical beliefs, sex life, or sexual orientation. This one is a bit more positive, but this alongside anti-discrimination law forms the grounds for litigation against automated discrimination. It provides the grounds for civil society to hold the government accountable. But again, it has exemptions to it. Going back to the Paris Olympics, isolating people on cameras using AI for these characteristics is banned by this and by anti-discrimination law. So what France put a lot of money into doing is having AI-enabled surveillance systems that follow or target people based on clothing. And as a hijabi, I can't possibly think of any clothing that could be used to discriminate against. But even outside of hijab, think of traditional clothing, think of clothing worn by certain groups in society. Now, I'm raising this example from the AI Act really to show that even good legislation is reliant on a strong and comprehensive foundation of anti-discrimination legislation for it to be effective. And in most cases, this doesn't exist. So I want to end with this quote from the Amnesty International report on the Dutch benefit scandal that I started with. To me, this really summarizes the issue that we see in this space. and that we should all be cautious of when we see AI systems being used for efficiency purposes. Governments around the world are rushing to automate the delivery of public services, but it's the most marginalized in society that are paying the highest price. And so, as a closing remark, I want to leave you with the most important question when thinking about AI systems. Who is the most likely to be harmed, and who is the least likely to benefit? I'll say it again. Who is the most likely to be harmed, and who is the least likely to benefit? Because the policies to protect people are too far behind for us to rely on them. Thank you.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much, Alexandra. This absolutely brilliant talk. And thank you for making the time for us. And hopefully you'll be answering our questions now. So if anybody does have questions, please pop them in the chat towards Ekua, and she's collating them at the moment. But there's so much more work that needs to be done to redress the imbalance within the media and algorithms, which is really shaping public opinion and government policy at the moment. So it's really important work that you're doing. It's absolutely brilliant. Thank you. Let's see. Do we have lots of questions? Okay. Right, I do have one question so far. So, are Femiso working with any other communities that might be suffering from this type of abuse? For example, the Gypsy Roma traveller community, referencing what happened in Manchester this last weekend.
Yeah, so on the issue of AI specifically, we're not working with them. However, organizations like PICUM and other groups which also represent travelers are ones that we have worked with in the past, and they've been very good supporters of Femiso, because there are also a significant portion of the Roma community that are Muslim. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Another question, how can evidence be collected without falling under the restriction of GDPR?
I mean, it depends very much the purpose for collecting that, if people are aware that you're collecting that information. I'm also not a GDPR specialist, so I don't think I can properly answer that question.
Any more questions? Does anybody have any more questions? Let me just quickly see.
I can also talk about other case studies if people are interested in hearing more about those.
Yeah, I want to hear a bit more about Prevent. I mean, what kind of, have you been able to do any work towards Prevent or not really?
Again, unfortunately, not really. Femiso being a Europe-based organization, we tend to focus a bit more on like our local regions. The thing with Prevent as well is that in the UK, we don't have to declare what AI systems we're using and how we're using them. So as far as I'm aware, Prevent haven't declared that they're using any AI-enabled systems for risk assessments or things like that. My concerns from the information that I've seen with Prevent is around data sharing and the fact that they share it with border control and others, and that this is a really, really problematic level of surveillance that Muslims that en masse who are being referred to Prevent aren't really deserving of.
Okay. There's another question. Are there UK AI systems that we should be concerned about, both at government organization and private company levels, hiring and firing AI systems, and also for shifting out CVs based on profiling?
I mean, those are definitely a risk. We don't have the legislation that protects us in the UK. I can't talk to specific examples that I know that are active. But for instance, I know that Google used to have a system that it used, which was AI enabled, to judge who should have a promotion. But what they found out was that it was massively favoring men over women. And when they dug a little bit more into it, because they'd taken out all identifying characteristics, so any like personal pronouns or things like that had been blanked, but it had associated attributes that more men did, which in this case was things like watching anime, with something that made you good at computer science. And so women who put down that they spent their time knitting or, I don't know, doing other things that weren't watching anime weren't seen as being good in computer science by the data that had been fed. Again, with UK examples, government departments don't have to declare what algorithms they're using, how they're using them. The Department for Work and Pensions have said they're using one, and I think that's one that in a couple of years we're going to have a watershed moment where we find out quite how much damage this has done. And I think until we get to a stage where government departments are obligated to say what they're using and how they're using them, there's not much we can do beyond saying this looks like it's a problem, but we can't say for certain what the cause of it is, how bad it is.
Wow. I think that we're gonna have some real problems with Prevent. I think that there's probably so much data that's been gathered over the years. With regard to facial recognition in Europe, are they far ahead of the UK, do you think, in terms of what they've been implementing, or are we at the same level?
I mean, definitely the AI Act is a big step ahead. It says that you can't do live facial recognition, and it puts in place grounds to stop it being abused. So the organization I spoke of before, La Quadrature du Net, launched a massive campaign and are still running this campaign against this massive increase of surveillance that they're seeing specifically in France, and they're legally challenging it where possible. In the UK, we don't have the systems to legally challenge it, which is why live facial recognition is being used on the streets of London. And there's brilliant organizations like Big Brother Watch that I recommend you guys follow on Blue Sky, or what was known as Twitter, because they're doing fantastic work on this. But again, all they can do is raise awareness and say this is not something we should have. There's no grounds to say that what's being done is illegal, because it isn't.
That's quite scary. Okay, another question. What actions do you suggest we take part in to deal with this? How can we get this understood by ordinary people? And do we have simple PowerPoints that we could be using to share this information with other people?
In terms of resources, so I've shared a lot of different examples and case studies drawn from other places, and I'm very happy to share the reports that I've mentioned. When it comes to making other people aware, I think most of us are aware that there is a slight bias, or more than slight bias, in a lot of these technologies. So I mentioned at the start that Femiso ran a red teaming exercise. So in that exercise, we had
Can I ask
30...
what's red teaming?
Yeah. So we had about 30 people in a room, and what we did was we gave them 10 different scenarios and asked them to challenge AI chat models like ChatGPT, Gemini, to say things they shouldn't in line with those 10 situations. And I remember when I was talking to the organization that set up this platform for us, and I was like, okay, here's an example one that we might give participants, which is get the large language model to describe the hijab as oppressive to women and girls. And so she went, okay, well, as an example, let me just type that in to the search bar and press enter. And it immediately listed 10 reasons why the hijab is oppressive to women and girls. There was no hijab is an independent decision that people make. It can be abused and forced onto people, but on the whole, a lot of people choose to wear it. It immediately went, it denies women the right to bodily autonomy and a lot of other things. I think most of us are aware that this is a problem. I think what we need to do is be much more willing to talk about how it's a problem and not just go, yeah, but it's convenient. And I think we need to be much more willing to challenge the use of these. My big concern, again, is the way that it's used, especially in government systems as a cost-saving measure. An example that comes to mind often with this is the Compass system, which was used in the US. Now, this is a system that lots of states put a lot of money into buying, and it was meant to advise judges on the risk of prisoners to reoffend. The idea is if it gave you a high score and you were at high risk of reoffending, you would be given a longer prison sentence, because that was somehow meant to fix the fact you were at high risk. And if you were at low risk of reoffending, you would be given a smaller or no prison time. What was found after a lot of civil society, again, pushing on this topic, was that the model was, probably not unsurprising for the US, but very, very racist. A Black man's risk of reoffending was inflated about 5 times over what his actual risk was, whereas a white man's risk was massively deflated and put to almost nothing in almost every situation. Despite this, the system is still used in many states because as far as the company is concerned, we just advise. We're not telling you to take this decision. And then they also said that the problem isn't the work they did. The problem is the judicial system has always been racially biased. And so all of this would have happened with or without them anyway.
Oh, wow.
Which, as far as I'm concerned, is a poor excuse. But the system is still being used in different states. So there you go.
Wow, that really is so frightening. And then to make excuses for it as well. I suppose that's where the laziness of humans who should be checking comes in, and why it's so important to not be handing over complete control or having some sort of safeguards in place.
And I think, again, we need to, the argument that they're putting forward is that rubbish in equals rubbish out. And that's definitely part of the problem. But I still think that another problem we don't talk about enough is, are these systems being used in a way that their outcome can be anything other than rubbish out? Radar, for instance, is exactly one of these systems where the only outputs it will give you, even if they filled it in with your information and then the only thing that they know about you is you smiled at someone or you wore yellow boots, the lowest output it will give you is that you're a moderate risk to society. And I think it's things like this where there is an immediate framing that's problematic.
Really interesting question. It's a complicated question, but the changes to UK GDPR law that are being tabled as motions, along with a quite disturbing NHS contract for FDP being granted to Palantir, do you have concerns on how this can be used to target those who access our NHS or asylum seekers system?
I think anyone in this space has massive concerns about Palantir because of all of their links with highly problematic military organizations and policing systems. In fact, I think a year or so ago, they had a contract in Germany with some of the states to provide assistance to the police, and civil society managed to push them out by saying, not in our backyards, basically, and pointing to a lot of problems. I think that from a lot of discussions that I've had with academics in this space, any of them working on healthcare and large language models and AI models that are being given to nurses are already very, very concerned about the impact this is having on the ability, on nurses' ability to advocate for their patients. And it's limiting what they can offer as support. And I remember a professor that I was talking to about a year and a half ago saying again that in a few years, the actual extent of these problems is going to come to light. And it's at that point that everyone's going to be like, why did we rush into this?
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
I think that that's what we're heading to.
Great question. What can I do to share awareness at uni or at work?
In university, I think whatever area you're studying, look into how AI is being used in that space. So I've mentioned specifically from a political lens, but the use of note-taking models, and actually even Zoom is slightly problematic if you start looking into all of the data they have the right to when you participate in a Zoom meeting, from your image to the backgrounds that you share to your voice in some cases.
Wow.
So I would say that just look at the systems that you're used and are being encouraged for you to use for efficiency reasons, and look into what data they have if that's of interest to you, or look into who they partner with if that's of interest to you, or even just look at what information from your own stead you're being expected to give to them as a right to access the platform. I think it's very interesting that recently we've moved from this idea of privacy as a right to privacy as a commodity. And I'm definitely guilty of this. The number of places that you have to get a login to access discounts, which makes things a normal price. Like, it's not even that I get suddenly half price or 75% off different things. It's to make things affordable now. You have to give away data. And I think it's very, very dangerous to be moving so quickly in that direction.
Yeah. How do they train these AI models, and what can we do to manipulate that algorithm in our favor as Muslims? Don't know if it's possible. Is it even possible?
So there's been a lot of discussions recently on Twitter about should left-leaning people stay on Twitter and try to fight the algorithm and everything that Elon Musk is doing to promote a specific narrative, or whether there should be a mass exodus of Twitter. And I've heard a lot of different points on this. I think what I would say is that a lot of platforms and a lot of algorithms will have a specific framing and outlook that you will be pushed towards, and a specific reaction they will be looking at you, you to react in a specific way. On an individual level, there's not much you can do to challenge that. I can't say that opting out is a better response than trying to challenge it, but I will say that on an individual level, it's very difficult. So one of the things that made the red teaming exercise a powerful exercise to do was doing it as a collective. If individually people had typed in to Gemini, describe the hijab as oppressive to women and girls, you would have had 30 people that were like, that's a bit miserable. When you have 30 people in a room all doing that together and all going, well, you phrased yours slightly differently to mine, or you used a different language than I did, and it still came out with this, you can start to see the extent of the problem.
I mean, that would probably be a really good exercise in universities, or, when you're trying to get that message through to people about just how powerful AI systems are against us, like pitted against us already. Okay, can we develop, or are there any of our own Muslim or minority AI systems that can support our interests or help combat what may be out there already, not in our own interest currently? I suppose there's a similar question to the last one.
Yeah, it's similar. I can't speak to that because what we've been looking into is more the misuse of these technologies.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are plenty of startups that try to take an innovative approach to this. I think I could be annoying and point out the larger issues also with using these technologies and rushing into them, which is that very often there has to be buy-in of products produced by larger companies, which can be problematic. So I was recently at the World Health Summit, and there was a presentation on a panel on inclusive digitalization for global health. And Amazon was represented there and said the problem with inclusion in global health is that there isn't enough digital infrastructure. So you should all pay us to provide you with digital infrastructure. And as far as I'm aware, that's not the biggest problem with inclusion in digital global health. But for these countries and for others to be part of the discussion, you do have to buy software or devices that give data and grant access to a lot of these other companies. So I don't know how easy it is to fully escape this loop. And again, I'm not saying that disengaging is the best response. I'm simply saying that I don't know what the best response is.
Yeah. It is a minefield. There's a question from me. I mean, I'm sure that you've probably sat around and thought about this, but if things are left unchallenged, where do you see civil society's rights in, like, say, 5 years?
I think civil society, like, their job is to challenge the government and to hold them accountable and to try to speak up on these issues. I think if there are no changes to UK policy similar to the AI Act, which creates more grounding to challenge, I think that even without that, we will see civil society challenging on this, but it will just take longer because the building up of evidence to get that information to fit into the current data protection laws that we have or anti-discrimination laws that we have will just take longer.
And
I think it's a question of the damage that will be done in the meantime.
Yeah. And if you could tell the Green Party or advise the Green Party to maybe do, I don't know, top 3 things or even top 1 thing, what apart from introducing a similar AI Act, what would you advise us?
Definitely for government departments to declare what AI systems they're using, because that is the sort of first ground for you to be like, okay, now we can challenge this because we know this is where the problem might be coming from. And of course, systemic racism and systemic Islamophobia will also be a contributing factor to all of this. But having that beginning of transparency is fundamental to be able to challenge any of these systems. I think the next one I would say is if they do have to use an AI system for whatever public service, then making it mandatory for it to say what issue it has raised and then for it to be checked by a human. I'm not saying that would solve it, but for it at least to highlight why it has considered this to be a problem will be the beginning steps for us to understand on what grounds it challenged it. Were those actually the grounds that were right for it to challenge this contract, or has it made an incorrect assumption? And I think the third one would just be, please get a definition of Islamophobia that we can start using and being like, this is the accepted definition of Islamophobia. We'd all be very grateful for that.
Yeah. I think that's definitely next one on our list to be doing. Yeah, somebody's written, we shouldn't want AI that are biased to be pro-Muslim or anti-Muslim. We need them to be neutral and objective and irrespective of gender, religion, or race, etc., which I think is very sensible. Toheen has his hand raised. Toheen, would you like to ask a question?
It's just a comment because you mentioned right at the beginning of your talk about assalamu alaikum, by the way. You mentioned right at the beginning of the talk that this is an intersectional issue, and following on from what you said about services needing to adopt some form of AI technology, a lot of that stuff is possible to be developed and delivered in-house in the UK, but we don't do it because we don't look to the communities that have the talent to be able to do it because they are marginalized. So is that not something that the Green Party also need to be looking at, is how do we foster the intersectional talent that we have to fix the problem so we don't depend on Palantir?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. I think the first thing I would raise is that a very big problem in this space is that people with these skills get paid a lot of money by industry for these skills. So it's very difficult to find people with those skills that will give their work and their specialism for much less money, for much smaller projects, for NHS or for the Department for Work and Pensions. When I talk about it being an intersectional issue, I also want to raise things like, I'm going to try something disastrous and try to share my screen again, but I hope you can see this slide. Now, this is the slide that was used by Amnesty, the graphics that were used by Amnesty International to describe their report about the Denmark scandal that's currently going on. And it's brilliant to see a hijabi on there, but their report didn't mention Islamophobia. They spoke to a Muslim organization and they described a group of people that I would describe as predominantly Muslim. And yet that wasn't something they pulled out in their report. And I think a big problem in this space is that because the Muslim identity is intersectional. As I mentioned at the start, I'm an English convert to Islam. So I don't count as someone who would put Arab on a form or Pakistani on a form. I'm also someone that has English as a first language. So if you were looking from a language perspective, when looking at these characteristics, I wouldn't come out. So when I talk about the intersectional element, I mean that when organizations like Amnesty do this fantastic work, Muslim falls through the gap as an identity that's potentially being discriminated against because we're not a category that's normally considered. Race is considered, and that's fantastic. Socioeconomic status is considered, and that's fantastic. But Islam and Muslim as a group is normally missed out a lot. And that's why I think the work of Femiso and other organizations is so vital to go to these organizations and say, have you actually thought about Muslims and their experience in this work? Radarite is a system that I'm terrified by in Germany. I am yet to find a civil society organization that is writing on this problem. And I've spoken to a lot of civil society organizations, but none of them are aware of it because, again, it's something that's very specific to the Muslim community, and there just isn't the awareness of this problem.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite clear that Amnesty International recognized that this is a Muslim problem. I mean, why is it that they don't want to use the words?
I couldn't tell you. I want to say that it's in good faith that they found that it's people of Afghani heritage, it's people of Lebanese heritage, it's people of Iraqi heritage. And so they've made the link that it must be a refugee tag that's coming up to these people's names. And they just haven't made that higher association that maybe it's also a Muslim identity. Because again, when they talk about how it's a refugee thing, they don't mention Ukrainians. And this report was published on the 12th of November this year. So this isn't something that has been 10 years in the works before the problems we're currently seeing began. This is a very new thing. I want to give them the benefit of the doubt because, as I say, they're doing brilliant work. They do lay out a lot of the problems. They did speak to a Muslim organization on the ground. I'm not sure why they have chosen not to mention Islamophobia as a thing with this.
Sure. Yeah. Lots of people are asking, there's quite a few similar questions, but one person's asked, what are the socials for your organization? Can you signpost them, please? Because I think lots of people are really interested in knowing more and getting involved. So
thank you as well to whoever asked that, because I'm sure otherwise I would have got a telling off from the organization.
You would have, yes.
Yes. The best platform to follow us on is Instagram. We're also on LinkedIn and Twitter because I refuse to call it X. And you can find us at just @Femiso, so FEMYSO. We also have a website which you can find by just typing in Femiso online, and you'll see a lot of the projects and updates that we run. If anyone is interested, we actually have a training course that we're running in partnership with the Council of Europe for student activists. And I think the application for that closes in a few days. But if you are someone that would be interested in that training, please do apply. Always interested in having new voices attend and participate.
Thank you. That's really super. Another question here, and this might be to our Green members who might know, so maybe Arik might know a little bit more about this, or Zach. Are there any Green policies or intended efforts for new policy from the Greens to help our causes in the future with AI tech? And can you signpost it here if you do know? Do you guys, I don't know if anybody who's here would be aware of that, or maybe if you're aware of that. Alexandra?
I wouldn't be aware of it, but I would be keen to know the answer. And I think that could also be a good place to close off.
I can jump in very briefly. First of all, I've got the mic. Just thank you, Alexandra. That was incredible. So much information and just loads to think about. I can speak to London specifically, where we're doing a lot of work with Big Brother Watch. who I know Alexandra shouted out, and also my colleague Zoe, who sits on the Police and Crime Committee. For a long time, we've been sounding the alarm about artificial intelligence. LinkedIn as well. I ran a campaign a couple of years ago called Spy Free Shopping, which was around private companies and their use of private technology to companies like Lidl were starting to trial silly, I say silly as in they were phrasing it like apps where, you know, what vegetable are you? But really they were tracking and recording that information. So we've been asking lots of questions around intersectionality and how the data has been recorded. Anyway, so that's going on in London. I'd say nationally, I think most people on the call will know this, but our policy is decided by the membership. It's one member, one vote. We do have some policy on artificial intelligence, but I would say it is very surface level at the moment and requires a lot more kind of depth. Maybe for those people who know Alexandra on this call or follow socials might smile nicely and encourage them to help us develop that policy in the future and bring it to the conference. But I think it'd be really good to see the party have further policy on this, because I think there's policy on artificial intelligence, there's policy on facial recognition. I don't think there's much policy that brings those together in an intersectional lens. And from the lecture tonight, that's clearly really, really important. Arik can probably add to that as well, because I know he works in this space.
Sorry, I can't turn my video on for some reason. Yeah, just to echo what Zach said, we've done a lot on facial recognition in Newham, as I think Alexandra knows. We passed a motion a couple of, sorry, my daughter's in the background saying, "Oh, McDonald's," I don't know if you hear that. We passed a motion to like state that the council's against the use of facial recognition surveillance in Newham, but obviously that doesn't have legal power. It just says that democratically, if you deploy it in Newham, it goes against the will of the council. So that's one thing that Green councillors can do. But I agree with Zach that it needs to be a more like comprehensive green AI policy, and there's a lot of like laws coming into. The UK government's going to put forward a lot of laws on regulating what they call the most powerful AI models. So things like ChatGPT and these other platforms. And I've heard, don't know whether this is true, but I've heard that they're going to be regularly legislating on AI in the next in this parliament. So I think it will come up quite a lot. Yeah, when it comes to work, when it comes to data use, and all of these other areas. Also, that was a bit, Alexandra.
It'll be something that I think we need to bring to we need to work on so we can take it to the next conference. But thank you so much for your input, both of you there. I think we've asked lots of questions, and I'm sure that there's more questions to be asked. But I'm aware of the time, so without further ado, I want to thank everybody, especially Alexandra, for making the time to speak to us today. It was an absolutely brilliant and very important talk. Massive thank you to all of our speakers in this whole series who've given us a lot to think about. And our amazing tech team, Ekua, Sami and Asma, who've been helping behind the scenes to collate all the information and posting all the videos online. And to all of you who've taken the time to actually attend and interact with the session and ask questions and made it worthwhile by generating good discussion and new action points for us to take forward. That's invaluable. So thank you so much to everybody for that. Now, hopefully we would have recorded this session, so that will be on our YouTube channel. And please be aware that Muslim Greens have a YouTube channel. But in keeping with Islamic traditions, I want to read a passage of the Quran for when we close gatherings. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wal asr, inna al-insana lafi khusr, illa alladhina amanu wa amilu as-salihat, wa tawasaw bil haqqi wa tawasaw bis sabr. So this is the chapter, The Declining Day. By the passage of time, surely humanity is in grave loss, except for those who have faith, do good, and urge each other to the truth, and urge each other to persevere. So a reflection on that. We are at a loss when it comes to things like climate crisis and struggling against fascism, colonialism, and capitalism. But God tells us that we aren't at loss if we maintain hope that things can change, and we physically do good to bring about that change. And we urge each other to counter the fake news narratives. And when we feel down, we urge each other to keep going. So I urge all of us to never feel despair, but keep each other going in this struggle. So thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully we'll have more from Muslim Greens in the future. Jazakallah khair.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Many
Assalamu alaikum.
thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.